Hello, welcome everyone. We're excited to have you on with us today. We're going to give it just a minute as everyone is starting to enter the webinar. And in true fashion, if you've joined us before, you know that when we start off, we like to have everyone just drop in the chat where you're joining us from today. So I'll lead off. Well, yeah, I say Washington, D.C., but everyone reminds me that you have to actually be in the district to claim that. So I'm technically Maryland. I saw that, Beth. Thank you. Thank you. That's how I feel too. Thank you, Beth. I appreciate that. I get constantly reminded. Oh, I love that, Nick. Makes me want to grab a permanent marker and draw a message to the crew here. Cool. We've got some Wyoming. I'm originally from Utah, so neighboring Wyoming. So that's fun to see. We've got some Wisconsin. This is really testing my knowledge here. This is embarrassing. I have to know these acronyms. Alexandria, Virginia. We've got some Kansas, some Colorado, some West Coast. Oregon represent. South Carolina. It's fun to see. Awesome. Well, it's really fun to see. If you are rejoining us for a webinar, give us a thumbs up in the chat. And if this is your first time, give us the little prayer hands. If this is your first webinar, send the little prayer hand emoji. And if you've joined us before, curious to see a thumbs up. I can't even find the thumbs up now that I'm looking for it. I can see a thumbs down. That's not good. Kind of fun to see. Well, awesome. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started. Oh, Celeste, mixing it up here. I like it. All right. Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Just as a reminder, Institute is a CAE and CCE approved provider. And so this webinar does qualify for 1 hour of CAE credit and 1 point for CCE credit. And you can request a webinar certificate after the webinar. From our inbox, the iom@uschamber.com. I will drop this in the chat. And both recording of this presentation today and the PowerPoint will be available on our website in our webinars and resource center. And I will also drop that in the chat. And that's typically about 48 hours after the webinar. If you do have any questions that come up throughout, please drop them in the chat and we will circle back to answer those or answer those during, if possible. And we will leave some time at the end as well for a question and answer. So to start off, we have Bob Thomas with us today. Bob is the Chief Operating Officer and Integrator for the Michigan Chamber of Commerce and the Executive Director for the Michigan Chamber Foundation. So as the Executive Director for the Foundation, he oversees the alignment and direction of its leadership programs, public policy research, and events related to free enterprise, competitiveness, leadership, and entrepreneurship. He is the former chair of the Midwest Board of Regents with us, the National Board of Trustees, and the Curriculum Committee with Institute. So he has been across all platforms of the program, and most recently as one of our faculty members. So with that said, Bob, we will turn it over to you to kick us off.
Thanks, EC. I'm glad to be here, and I see a ton of friends in the chat box. So I'm looking forward to really a two-way conversation here. Because what I'm going to present to you are only 5 ways to use your foundation, and there are so many more. But I just wanted to give a good lead into what's possible, probably some of the more common areas that people could use their foundation. But certainly would love to hear how all of you are using it or would like to use it if you're developing one. So that said, let's just jump right in. I've been here at the Michigan Chamber just over 25 years, and my first job was to be a copywriter in our foundation for a program called Drugs Don't Work, which was a drug-free workplace program. And then Leadership Michigan was my first big program that we worked on. So we're going to talk a little bit about leadership programs today. But first, what's the difference between a 501c6 and a 501c3, just to get to the basics? Most of you are probably part of 501c6 organizations. Your association or chamber was organized in the interest of its members. And so whatever their common interest is, whether it's your trade association or your community, is largely what the 501c6 is organized for. It's a nonprofit in its own right, exempt from federal tax, funded primarily through dues, contributions, other fees, et cetera. It has no or little restrictions on lobbying. They're in fact action groups, here to represent the interests of its members and to hopefully provide some momentum behind what they're interested in, and generally could be declared self-exempt. Most people, anybody can start a chamber as a nonprofit, as long as you follow all the other nonprofit rules, but that's largely why you're organized. A 501c3, however, is a charitable organization and has a lot more hoops that you have to jump through in order to claim your exemption. So there's some actual tests and a form you have to file with the IRS to be declared a 501c3 charitable organization. You have a much more limited scope in terms of what's allowable program-wise, primarily for charitable, scientific, educational, or certain other purposes that benefit the community. You're exempt from state and federal tax, funded primarily through contributions, grants, and fees. And you have heavy restrictions on lobbying. So how I find these two organizations to work is that they should work complementary of each other, and that the 501c6 can be and should be the parent organization as the action group, and the 501c3 is the complementary charitable arm. At the Michigan Chamber, we've talked about it as the heart and the fist. The fist is our 501c6 and our heart is our 501c3, the softer side. We're able to complement some of the things that we do on our advocacy program. Some of the benefits of a foundation for the affiliated organization, I think it's a great place to deepen engagement. It helps broaden our stakeholder reach. There are a number of organizations who do not like the advocacy part of our 501c6 organizations, and so they're looking for other ways to get involved and to make an impact. A 501c3 is a great way to grow resources for your community. I don't know if you've experienced this throughout COVID, but it feels like 501c6 organizations were deliberately carved out of a lot of assistance programs during the pandemic, and that 501c3 organizations were the natural go-to because they were creating more of a social assistance arm for their communities or for their constituents. And then businesses, of course, were seen as needing help. But 501c6 organizations didn't seem to enjoy the attention. And so having that 501c3 really helps to broaden out that resource group. And then lastly, helps grow or create awareness for your community or an issue or an industry. And we're going to talk about some of those things. For the investor, I think this is really important too, is understanding our customer. The benefits of giving to a foundation versus the 501c6 is they can expand their impact. A 501c6 is an ordinary business expense, but a contribution to a charitable organization is considered charitable and so enjoys a lot more tax deductibility. There's the enhanced financial benefit as a result, and then increased accountability because 501c3s are under a lot more scrutiny. There's usually a lot more reporting required. And so for contributors who are looking for an impact and proof of impact, the foundation might be a better place to give. I mentioned we're going to talk about 5 ways that you could use your foundation, and there are really countless ways to use it within the scope of that program that we mentioned that the IRS guidelines carve out. But I think these 5 are probably the most common and probably the most impactful, depending on what you're looking for. The first one is leadership development. And so when I think about leadership development, I think this is probably the greatest place for impact of our chambers of commerce. We're in the midst of a major generational shift. We're seeing a lot of really heightened divisiveness across the country. And I think this is a place that we've lost sight of some leadership opportunities. And our chambers and associations are exactly the right types of organizations who can deliver this type of programming. And it happens to be one of the leading ways a foundation could be used. So here are some examples of what leadership programs might look like within your organization. Probably some of the most trending leadership programs right now are in women's leadership, youth leadership, our emerging leaders programs, formerly our young professional groups, a leadership exchange where leaders from 2 different communities or 2 different industries might be interested in learning about each other's communities, how they complement each other, how they could learn from each other. Community orientation programs, I think, are really important. Our Leadership Michigan program at the Michigan State Chamber was primarily an orientation program to help business leaders understand what resources were available around the state and what kinds of industries or communities made up the fabric of our overall economic climate. Leadership programs could be used for talent retention. If you're looking to engage interns for some of your larger employers, so they can see how great your community is and why they should stay after they complete their internship. I think that's a great opportunity to use your leadership programs. Elected official orientation. As you get a new class of elected officials every couple of years, this is a great place to help them understand the resources available from the business community, what they should or shouldn't know, maybe what they've heard, dispel some myths about your community. That's a great opportunity for your program. Or if you're a trade association, helping them understand the depth of your knowledge as an industry leader, and how they can understand your industry better so they can legislate better. Candidate recruitment programs. If you're looking to engage business people in running for elected office, helping them understand what's required, how to be good legislators or elected officials on the front end rather than after they're already elected, can hopefully help build a better lawmaker. And then this is something I'm seeing a lot more often now, are mentorship programs. And so that's helping lift up that next generation of leader. Some examples that I wanted to point out. The first one is at the Plano Chamber. They have a number of leadership programs. And actually, this is probably the most common. When I was doing some research, I could find hundreds of leadership programs all across the country hosted by their chambers or associations. And one resource here would be the Community Leadership Association. If you're looking for some best practices or to network with those folks, that would be a great place to look. But I'm highlighting the Plano United Business program in particular, which is out of Plano, Texas. Kelly Marsalis is the director there. And the Plano United Business is a 2-year mentorship program for minority businesses to help them be more successful. And that complements part of their community workforce, philanthropy, and leadership development programs, which are more traditional in nature, but I thought this was an interesting one to take a look at. And you can download the slides after the presentation and click on any of these links to get more information about their programs. And then the second example of a leadership program, which is probably non-traditional for chambers, but probably more common for trade associations, and that's the National Association of Broadcasters Leadership Foundation, focusing on developing leadership, advancing diversity, and highlighting community service for their industry. So you can see where leadership programs don't necessarily have to fall in your traditional leadership development, as much as they are there to help create community and broaden the depth of leadership development within your industry group. The second common way that foundations could be used is for research and information. And here are a couple of examples of what that might look like. It could be community scorecards or dashboards. It could be issue studies. If there's a particular issue in your community that needs a lot of attention, and maybe you need some additional research or to disseminate information about that particular issue. White papers, they could just be thought leadership pieces from your foundation. Think tanks, benchmarking surveys. Maybe you don't have to have an opinion about any of the issues as much as you just want to alert folks to where your community or where your industry stands in particular areas. Economic forecasts, data analysis. There's a huge market there for people to just synthesize the information. Your foundation can be a great tool for that. State of the industry reports, so state of agriculture or state of broadcasting. And then your strategic plans or vision documents for your industry or community are also great ways to disseminate research and information. The important thing to here to remember is that these are all communication tools to help either distill information or present a point of view on behalf of your organization that could certainly complement your 501c6 advocacy agenda. So if you're looking for data to back up a particular position, or if you'd like to dispel some myths or raise awareness about certain issues, then this is a great way to use your foundation. Usually these can be underwritten by a number of sponsors or contributors who are interested in the issue or in supporting the community, and are very helpful to create that awareness. And then also all of these could also be used as the premise for an event. So if you're looking at adding more events to your schedule, because who isn't, the research and information angle is certainly a way to do that, where you could release a study or create a dialogue around a particular issue. And actually, all of the examples that I'll be sharing today can also be used as the basis for awards programs, which are a huge engagement opportunity, and raising awareness about a particular business or individual who's contributing to any of these items, which are certainly helpful. And I see in the chat about foundation and 501c3. I am going to use them interchangeably as the same type of organization. Some examples here for research that I'd like to highlight. The first one is the Minnesota Chamber Foundation. As a statewide chamber, they have a number of economic research tools that call out attention to what the economic climate looks like in their state. It's not just one study, they have a number that you could reference. The second is the Women in Transportation WTS Foundation. Their particular study is looking for ways to advance women in the industry. So there's a lot of benchmarking data that they share in order to make the case for more women in their industry. And then the last one I'm sharing is the Fresno Clovis Convention and Visitors Bureau Foundation. I see a number of CVBs that use data to help promote their community and to share data about how important tourism is to their particular economic climate. The third way I think organizations can use their foundations are to award grants and scholarships. Um, Typically, grant-making organizations are private foundations, but I've seen a number of 501c6 organizations use their foundations to create opportunities to give money away. And this is extremely powerful, particularly if you're looking at engaging the next generation of professional or what the next generation of leadership might look like in your community. So these could look like college scholarships. I've seen financial support for first responders. There were a number of grants that were given out during the pandemic for economic development or for helping support small businesses. Microloans, if you became a lending organization through your 501c3, could certainly be very powerful. Those would be microloans of less than $1,000. You could collect interest, which helps build potentially an endowment or grow your fund. They don't all have to be grants. Small business grants I mentioned, so helping a small business with facade improvements, or you might even have a micro grant or micro loan to help them bridge payroll, for example, if they're a small enough organization in need of help. Professional development scholarships, helping people navigate their ways through different career options. Certainly at the Michigan Chamber, we use our foundation to help scholarships for Institute, which is exciting. And then other awards, so places to recognize excellence within your industry or your community for people who have made certain levels of achievements. And so these are powerful ways. Everybody likes to be able to give away the giant check. And so it's a great photo opportunity. Some examples here for me to call out would be the Chamber of Commerce of Eastern Connecticut. They have a grant program. They do a number of mini grants for nonprofits to assist their nonprofit community to help them grow. These could be funded through larger grants. They could be funded through government programs. Lots of different ways to secure the funds, but to help funnel that money to your nonprofit community. The North Texas LGBT Chamber of Commerce Foundation has a Scholars Gala used to create scholarships for LGBT youth. And then the Georgia Association of Women Lawyers provides grants and scholarships to assist lawyers that provide free legal services. And so it's a way for them to offset some of their pro bono work. So lots of creative ways that you could use grants, either for your community or for individuals to help support a greater cause. The fourth way I've seen chamber foundations be used effectively is in community development. And I'm going to talk about community development in a very broad way. So it doesn't have to be a location per se, as much as it is building communication within your industry. So this would be a great way for some associations to leverage it. These could look like workforce development programs. How are you building a workforce in your community? Business education partnerships, partnering with your schools, creating business opportunities or opportunities for business people to be in the school system. Career exploration programs, helping youth understand what career opportunities are available to them. I mentioned Main Street and facade improvement grants, beautification projects. These could be planting flowers along your sidewalks. That could all be run through your foundation. Disaster funds, disaster planning. A number of our communities have been hit by natural disasters. A foundation is a great way to raise money and also disseminate it to help people get back on their feet. I've seen silent observer programs or safety programs to help with our community safety. These are natural places to use your foundation. And then lastly, placemaking. So you might have art installations or benches to put in, more social congregation areas. Your foundation could be the spearheaded funding mechanism for that. Some examples that I wanted to point out here are the Greater Lehigh Valley Chamber Foundation. They provide the mini grants for a number of their downtowns or downtown businesses. This is a great place for them to leverage some of their economic development strength. And then the second one is the Partnership for Greater Chapel Hill Carrboro. They have a partnership for sustainable community. One of the programs I found interesting was they offer grants for families of first responders who were killed in action. And so that's a great place for them to support some of their most important citizens through their foundation. That's not naturally part of their chamber program. The fifth way I wanted to highlight today is about general awareness and understanding. And so, especially for our trade associations, when we want folks to understand our industries a little bit better, this is a great tool to use your foundation as a public education campaign. But certainly for chambers of commerce, this is a place to raise awareness about your community or raise awareness about certain industries within your community. And some of the things that you could do are creating DEI programs to highlight your diversity, equity, and inclusion. Public education programs about an industry, literacy programs. I'm going to talk about the Agriculture Association here shortly, the Farm Bureau, using their foundation for agriculture literacy. So not just reading and writing in the normal sense. You could offer books and publications, perhaps that you've got an author in your community and you want to help disseminate some of their information. You could use your foundation as the publishing clearinghouse. Training programs, workforce development programs, teacher resources. A number of organizations use their foundation to create learning modules that they can use in their classrooms. And teachers then use that to help create the business case for any particular career or industry information. Industry or community tours, if you'd like to get people to walk through your community or walk through a particular plant to learn more about an industry, help, again, create better understanding about what that industry does. And then just awareness and public information campaigns. You could run a series of flights or an undercurrent all year round and run it through your foundation. Some examples that I want to point out here include the Capital Region Chamber out of New York, and then the American Farm Bureau Foundation for Agriculture, I mentioned, and then the Michigan Association of Health Plans Foundation. I thought this was particularly interesting that they have two awareness campaigns, one around adverse childhood experiences and another for hereditary cancer risk. So they certainly complement their 501c6, but in very specific ways to raise awareness that ultimately support their members. So I want to pause here. We're about halfway through and see if there are any questions or other programs that you would like to highlight as it relates to foundations in your community or your industry.
And yeah, Bob, so we did have a couple comments going on here in the chat. So it looks like one question, have you ever had a chamber put a portion of their membership dues toward toward their foundation and use those funds to scholarship new members for their first year membership dues?
Sure. So I should also preface I'm not a foundation attorney or a foundation accountant, and I'm also going to speak about best practices and not necessarily what we do at the Michigan Chamber. So those are my disclaimers. There are some things that we do really well and some things that we don't, and I'm definitely highlighting organizations that do it better. I think that you can certainly use your chamber dues as long as you're number one, speak to an attorney and your accountant. But if you're very clear and upfront about the purpose for how they're using their dues and how you might be appropriating them to scholarship other members. But I think the better practice here is to offer an additional check-in box for people to allocate additional dollars beyond their dues to help support those causes to go toward the foundation. Because you'd want to make sure that they get credit for whatever contribution they're making as a charitable expense, and they know exactly where it's going and what it's being used for. I think some members might object to it, most of them probably not. And you might be surprised at how much money you could raise by doing a simple check on box rather than with an auto opt-in rather than automatically saying where they're going to go.
Excellent. And then we had some chatter just around other practices that some on the call have seen. We did have a question. Let's see. Oh, it sounds like another at previous chambers. So what they've done at other chambers. So it looks like those are the questions so far in the chat box.
Great. Yes. I mean, certainly a percentage of membership dues is a great way to fund your foundation. But I would certainly not discount the opportunity to ask for additional dollars. Again, we're trying to grow the pot, not necessarily split up the one that we've already got. And so by highlighting different ways that they could opt into programs, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I don't know if you're monitoring chatter, if you want me to read
A
off.
little bit. If you've got something you can spot out, that'd be
Yeah.
awesome.
So how do you handle brand issue of being chamber CEO and foundation executive director?
I don't really see it as a brand issue. To most people, when they look at the Chamber of Commerce or your association for that matter, they just recognize the one body, and that the 501c6, the 501c3, and any other subgroups or affiliated groups that you've got, you have a service corporation. We also have some 501c4s. To the general public and most donors, they just see the one brand as the primary organization. Where it makes a difference is certainly in the accounting space. And so when I call out the foundation, it's either because we're talking about a specific set of programs that separate and differentiate from our advocacy programs, or that we're trying to highlight what their financial benefit is to giving to the foundation versus the chamber proper. My experience has been we have a number of organizations, particularly larger corporations, that have capped out on their dues to the 501c6, but they still have dollars that they'd like to give. And in order to be able to do that, they need the foundation tool available to them. And so that's how I usually differentiate the brand is when it's to their financial benefit.
And then have you seen a foundation support workforce housing in a community, and in what way did they support?
So not specifically toward housing projects, but you could certainly use your foundation as a fundraising mechanism of an economic development activity. I do believe that you could use foundation funds, number one, to raise awareness about the workforce housing issue you've got in your community. But number two, they could also be used as gifts towards other organizations that work on workforce housing. So there might be a collaboration or partnership there you have with a contractor, Habitat for Humanity, other organizations. The challenge is you just want to make sure that they're being used that's within the mission of the foundation, and that you're allocating the dollars in the correct way. So but I think you could do it a couple of different ways based on how you're set up. Could be certainly awareness, could be grant making, or it could be to help funding projects.
And then I'm going to jump down a couple because it's on the same topic. We're in the midst of transitioning our funding for workforce development programs to our foundation. Traditionally, the funding has come into the chamber as a sponsored impact investor and 90% used for admin of the programs. If 100% of our sponsorships were received by the foundation, how would we ensure staff capacity as funds come into the foundation, i.e., what percentage of donations should be allocated to staffing to run the programs through an MOU? 90%, or is there best practice standard?
That's great. And I see a couple other questions getting into how are the foundations set up. So let's talk about, before I jump into those, some bonus ways to use the foundation. So I promised 5, and here's some additional ways, and then we'll talk about how you can set them up. So the bonus ways to use a foundation are almost as endless as the diversity you have in the programs that we already discussed, which include training programs, community engagement plans, minority assistance programs, issue summits, conferences and events. I mentioned all of these could have an event component. All of them could have an award component. Festivals, programs, parades, that's all part of community development. Get out the vote, civic engagement, just helping to raise awareness about how important it is to be a part of the process. Entrepreneur boot camps, small business assistance, hiring events. Hiring Our Heroes was a veteran hiring program out of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that was common in a lot of our communities. Pitch competitions for supporting entrepreneurship. Any celebration, any anniversary that you have for your community or a particular industry that's part of awareness. Corporate social responsibility, give back programs. Maybe you just want to do something for the local food bank or the homeless shelter through your foundation. That's a great way to raise dollars. Inclusion efforts, veterans programs, support for your arts, quality of life programs, military programs, honoring your military, recognizing your military and their contributions to your community, all great ways. But all of that said, to get to the question, there are some definitely issues that you need to be aware of in setting up a foundation or using your foundation. The first one is unrelated business income. So any dollars that come in have to be used for your mission. Otherwise, they're subject to unrelated business income tax, UBIT. And a number of these are usually advertising or renting facilities to outside groups. Just be aware of what's germane to your mission and what's not, and what's taxable or not because it falls within your mission or out of it. But the main issue, I think, to some of the questions here is about an unfocused program of work. And so when we try and be all things to all people or use all of our tools all at the same time in the same way, it's really easy to get diluted, to be a mile wide, inch thick. And the foundation certainly complicates some of that. I don't know if any of you have the same problem that most chambers have, which is you want to try and do a lot of things for a lot of different people because our memberships are so diverse. And when you add a new funding mechanism or a new set of programs into the mix, it's really difficult to try and do everything really well. So making sure that you've got good management of resources, that you've got a good handle on where the programs are going, is helpful, or could be harmful. But the helpful way is that, to the point of the question, you could use a lot of those dollars to offset chamber expenses. So if you've got staff that are operating in both camps, your 501c6 and your 501c3, you can allocate some of those dollars that have come in to help underwrite the cost of your staff, underwrite your facilities. They could pay rent back to the chamber. Program administration could include salaries. So it's just understanding how you're receiving funds, what the reporting purposes are, who you're accountable to, and to make sure that you're using them appropriately. So in the case of the workforce development programs, if a sponsorship is coming in and they're primarily for your foundation, but the chamber staff are the ones who are doing all the work, you could use those funds to help supplement or subsidize the chamber salaries, which is super helpful. That's a great way to use your foundation. Another issue is a lack of transparency. So if you're not upfront, if you're not reporting how those dollars are being used in the 501c3, you could run into some issues. As I mentioned, there's a lot more accountability with the 501c3 than there is with the 501c6, in the sense that people are looking for that kind of information. And so in order to continue to be healthy and vibrant and to receive contributions, I highly recommend that you're transparent. An unbalanced engagement or authority. It's important that the 501c6 is the parent organization and not the 501c3, especially if you're action oriented. If it's the other way around, the 501c3 is at risk of losing its nonprofit status because they're serving as an advocacy organization or dabbling in advocacy work. And so it's just making sure that you've got an appropriate balance there, and that the boards are competent and comfortable with what their roles are. Mixing funds, again, you should probably have two separate bank accounts. Actually, you do need two separate bank accounts, but you should definitely have two different accounts internally that you're managing funds, and whether or not they're intercompany to offset each other, just make sure that you've got a clear direction about where funds are, how they're being used, and where they're supposed to be, and that you're doing accurate accounting every month. Unclear roles and responsibilities for volunteers. Typically, you should have two separate boards, one for your 501c6 and one for your 501c3. They can sometimes function as the same group, or they're the same group having two separate functions, but it's where they start commingling or co-mixing their responsibilities, and they're not clear which part is the C6, which is a C3, that you could get into some trouble. And mostly it's because there's not a clear lane one way or the other for them to make decisions, and what the impact of their decisions are on each organization. Duplication of efforts with the parent org. Similarly, if both organizations are trying to do the same thing but in different ways, sometimes it gets confusing, especially to your donors or the general public who doesn't understand the difference in the two tools. Fundraising is always an issue. You can certainly get more money from grants and other sponsorships in your C3 than you can typically in your C6. But I highly recommend, if you're going to go with a fundraising strategy for your C3, that you have dedicated staff and resources to handle that, because there's so much available out there, but it also requires a lot more hoops or regulatory oversight in some cases. Particularly if you're getting federal or state government grants to support your foundation, that you've got somebody dedicated to that. And then lastly, reporting, especially for grant receiving organizations, that you've got somebody who can diligently file reports on time. That helps make sure that you're a good case for receiving future grants, but also checking all of the boxes appropriately, giving the appropriate narrative. This is a full-time job. I'll tell you, just from the few federal and state grants that we receive, there is a significant amount of time that you spend and making sure that you're reporting your dollars, your numbers, your narrative, all the data points that they're looking for. And sometimes that outweighs the benefit of receiving the dollars to begin with, because it takes you a little bit off track from accomplishing your mission. So that said, if you're looking at using your foundation to help offset some of your chamber expenses, because that's a more fundable organization, I highly recommend that you have an MOU or some sort of administrative agreement between the two organizations. Number one, that should hopefully protect both boards because they'll understand exactly how things are getting accomplished. And it also helps prevent them from separating if there ever was a desire to from your volunteers. The MOU usually keeps them connected and understanding how those resources are being used to accomplish each of their program of work. So a foundation is great, but it does come with some issues, and they're not insurmountable, but you should also be aware of how much work they are outside of your normal chamber programming. So that, I see there's a number of other questions coming in. So CC, you want to tee any of those up?
Yeah, so we'll go with some that are relevant to what was just talked about. There's a question of separate boards. I don't know if they're looking for any elaboration, but another question of separate D&O insurance.
Yes, each of them have separate policies because they're talking about separate people and different programs of work. And so when you have two organizations and the same number of staff, just be aware that you have twice as much work. So two boards, two bank accounts, two audits, two sets of insurance, two policy manuals. Now, all of them should complement each other and look similar with each other, but you have basically double the admin that goes into your organizations. Again, not insurmountable, but definitely a time commitment, resource commitment.
And then do you have a simple example of a management agreement or MOU between your C3 and C6?
I'm trying to think of, I've got a simple one. I don't, but one of the resources you might take a look at would be the ACCE Foundation Resource Guide at acce.org, and then the ASAE Foundation and Fundraising Guide. Both of those have amazing templates. They call out a number of other foundation programs. A in particular goes in depth into a number of articles about how to use your foundation. And so they might have a good MOU that you might reference.
And then Kate in the chat agrees. ACC has great examples. Both ACC and ASAE. There was another question I did want to just circle back to. Let's see. Are there any reasons a chamber would not want to incorporate as a 501c3?
I don't think chambers should be 501c3s. We have a separate designation in the IRS nonprofit exemption law, and so or rules. And so I think most chambers, just to keep things as black and white and compliant as possible, is that you should organize as a 501c6. That said, if you never plan on engaging in any sort of advocacy, engagement, or interacting with your elected officials in that advocacy role, I have seen some chambers of commerce organized as a 501c3, but I think this limits what you're capable of doing in any future direction that your organization might want to go in. So speak to an attorney to be 100% sure, but I would recommend chambers stay as 501c6 and their foundations are 501c3. So you have all the colors in the paint box.
Excellent. And then have you seen any university partnerships with these foundations to leverage funds?
I have seen some university partnerships, particularly with workforce development. A number of universities are organized as 501c3s as well, so it's a great complementary relationship that they can have with the Chamber Foundation, particularly on workforce development, training, career exploration. Great ways to interact that way. Probably also with internship programs, and it's just figuring out where your funding sources come from and how do they complement each other. So if you're clear on what your mission is and what each of the lanes are for both the higher ed institution and your foundation, it should be a good match.
And then there's a comment, most of what you talked about are things currently in my 501c6 budget. Why should we have a foundation if we are doing this work already?
So you don't have to. All of these things can be done through your 501c6. However, if you find that you are struggling with fundraising or you're looking for different ways to capture additional dollars, again, most 501c6s are not eligible for grants. The C3 is an amazing tool and also can help offset some of those things. So largely, I would recommend a 501c3 if you're looking at expanding all of your contribution opportunities back to your organization. Similarly, if you're going to open a for-profit organization, it's so that you can eliminate or create more opportunities to generate revenue outside of what your current mission is. So a 501c3 is similar. It's just to accept additional dollars that the C6 is not eligible for. But if you got it under wraps with your C6, that's definitely a way easier way to do it. But you're probably leaving money on the table.
And there's a comment trying to discern if it's an answer or an answer to another question, or if it's a separate question. So separate banking, which I think we touched on, and then building endowment for awards or grants.
Yeah, so endowments are also excellent ways to use your foundation, particularly if you are receiving a large sum of money from maybe there's a company that's going out of business, maybe there's another nonprofit that is wrapping stuff up and they need to give dollars. That's a fast way to fund an endowment. But if you're looking for a long-term sustainable strategy, an endowment is also a way to go. And you can use that as a fundraising mechanism, particularly if you don't have any hot programs that are running right now, but people are still looking for a tool to give to support the chamber. Ask them to support your endowment, and then it becomes self-fundable, and you don't have to rely necessarily on grants or outside groups. You can be self-funded. That's a lot harder to do. I don't know too many foundations for 501c6 organizations that have managed to be successful with an endowment, but that doesn't mean it's not possible or that your community wouldn't support it.
Well, those are the questions we have so far. If anybody else has questions, we have given the capacity to unmute yourselves. If you could just raise your hand in Teams, then we'll go ahead and just go in order if you'd like to ask questions live, or if you have questions that you'd like to type in the chat. We have a moment as well.
I'd also be curious to hear about other programs that you find to be successful for your own foundations.
Yeah, so it looks like we have another comment here. Our foundation also provides fiscal, sponsor, and agent services, which helps budding nonprofits and other community efforts get off the ground while working toward their own NP status. And then a question, can you speak to the advantages and disadvantages of being a private foundation versus a publicly supported charity?
That's a great question. I don't have in-depth knowledge other than private foundations are required to give grants and they have more restrictions on how to use their funds versus publicly supported charities. They're not subject to the same reporting requirements publicly, but they do have some important filings that have to do with the IRS. So those are definitely things you want to talk about with your accountant and your attorney. Most 501c3 organizations attached to a C6 are going to be publicly supported charities and would file a 990. And so that's what I could speak to. And then in terms of being a consultant for other nonprofits, I think chambers in particular, but certainly trade associations, are trusted resources for knowledge and information. And if you can build this capacity or competency, particularly for your community, it's a great place for you to exhibit leadership. And there's a lot of nonprofits that would look to the Chamber of Commerce for assistance or knowledge or know-how. And you certainly probably have those attorneys and accountants in your membership that would be willing to work with that population. So I think it's great business development as well as community engagement all around.
And we have a question, should the foundation board have a voting seat on the chamber board and vice versa?
Probably not, but it's probably good to have a little bit of overlap so that they're knowledgeable about each of their lanes. And then I also see the question about board positions for non-chamber members. If you're looking for ways to engage the community or people who are not naturally within your C6 membership, so for trade associations, that might be a complementary industry or something in your community. And for chambers, that might be companies that aren't authorized to be on your board or individual citizens that, especially community leaders that you'd like to have engaged, the foundation is the place to put them. And because you have much broader scope over decisions than just for your membership, since the chamber represents its members, the foundation supports the community, you have lots more engagement opportunities available to you. And so I think if you're especially looking to engage those people that wouldn't otherwise be invited, that's a great place to put them.
And then there's a question on any information on fiscal sponsor services that would be appreciated, any best practices. We're trying to limit people from starting a nonprofit just to accept a grant or two. I'd be curious thoughts on offering the service or reasons to steer clear.
I have seen, and the Michigan Chamber operates as a fiduciary for other groups that have chosen not to establish a 501c3. So I think it's a great way to offer that service, collect some of the dollars, and also accept administrative fees to do that. So it's not unprecedented, and it could be a great way to get into growing programming for your foundation. I don't know that I'd discourage anybody from setting up a 501c3. There's plenty of room to go around, and everybody's got a very specific interest. More importantly, I think you should stay within your mission and be hesitant about getting into programming that might dilute your overall mission, or take away from the rest of your programming. So just walk into it with your eyes open and be aware of where those resources might be conflicting or create more of a headache than it would having the other group independent from you.
And then given your years in running the foundation as executive director, what is your biggest lesson learned and what's a mistake made?
Probably my biggest lesson learned is that this is foundation programming is not just a little tack on to the rest of your stuff. If you're going to do it really well, make sure you're allocating appropriate resources to stay compliant with all of your regulations, that you are mindful of what the needs of your funders are. And really, the biggest challenge for me is that there's so much our foundation could do, and just not enough resources to get them all done. And then the biggest mistake made would probably be getting involved in programs thinking that they need to be around forever. It's okay to have a program that has a sunset date. So maybe it's got a 3-year program or even a 6-month program, and just call it good. They don't have to be perpetually funded. So the mistake I made is keeping a program alive a lot longer than it needed to be, which took away resources from other stuff we could be doing. Great question.
Yeah, and then we have a comment, a bit of caution that your C3 board remains purview alignment of the C6 via board seats. I've seen some C6 spinoff to be separate once grant and came in.
Yes, so this is where your bylaws are super important, making sure your board members are all on board and understand, again, their roles and responsibilities and how they complement each other. It'd be really easy for a foundation to spin off if they didn't have the appropriate oversight. So make sure the parent organization is the one that appoints board members to the C3. And that's kind of, rather than having the cross pollination or having board members sit on each one, it's just understanding who reports to whom and who carries the purse strings. So make sure that you've got appropriate reporting responsibility in that fashion. And make sure everybody's on board, because it's really easy to dip your fingers into other people's pools if you're not paying attention.
We've got a question in the chat and then a hand raised. So the question in the chat is, we've just completed our paperwork to establish our foundation. How do most foundations pay for the initial costs associated with the paperwork, such as insurance, et cetera?
That's usually a startup contribution from the parent organization. You can fundraise to help get those things covered. I think if you find some benevolent sponsors in your community, they would help get that all rolling. Or maybe it's the campaign that you run with your members to let them know you're starting a charitable arm to the chamber, or to your C6 association, and that's how you get them done. There's not a tremendous amount of costs that go into it, but probably a few $1,000s if you're going to do it right and hire attorneys to do your paperwork, and get your exempt letter. That's not inexpensive from the IRS and kind of important. So, I would definitely fundraise against it, or if you got some healthy reserves that you think it's a good investment to your foundation, that's a great way to fund it.
And then we've got a hand raised. Christine, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, this is a little more complicated than the chat. I want to expound upon, you made the comment about biggest mistake was, thinking a program had to live forever. And, chambers are really good at sacred cows. So I'm just curious if you have indicators of when to put something to death and how you went about that thought process to not make that mistake again.
I guess I would say first start with a strategic plan. Your chamber or association and your C3 should both have strategic plans, and you should be reviewing them regularly to make sure that you are fulfilling your plan ambitions. If you start to get outside of that scope, or you start to see mission creep, that's your first indicator that it's time to kill something. The second, if it's not profitable in the sense that the dollars raised are not covering the effort that goes into it, that's the second flag that it's probably time to kill it. That's not to say that loss leaders aren't important, or that you might have programs that are more expensive than what they bring in. If you are okay with that and you understand the benefit that it brings to your organization, certainly keep them alive because they create opportunities for other places in your organization. Great. But if they're a drain on your resources, get rid of it. And then I would say probably the third flag would be just the people power outside of the dollars. If it's creating a drain on your people, we had a program at one point where it was hard. It was pushing a wet noodle up a tall hill for our staff and volunteers to get excited about an event. And we always pulled it off, but it just was emotionally draining to get it going. We said it's not worth it anymore. And so it was keeping us from doing other things really well in the organization. And so we killed it. But that was probably 5 years after we should have killed it to begin with. So just be aware of some of those things. That would be my personal filter. But if other folks have ideas about how to kill sacred cows, I think that's a class at Institute. Go back to that checklist.
Well, we have no other questions in the chat. Anybody? We'll give it, I guess, another minute, or any last comments or thoughts, anybody?
Probably just a new plug. So CC, there's a new core class as part of the Institute curriculum built around foundations. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct, in the second year curriculum. And
so if you have staff that are going through the program, they can look forward to that and bringing back all sorts of great ideas to your organization. And then I know there's a new elective also built around some of that stuff too. That's a great place to go. I appreciate everybody sitting in on this one and hearing me talk about other organizations. The Michigan Chamber Foundation, we are really great at some of our virtual events right now, but I can tell you, we have not cracked the code on community development, research, some of the other things. So there are lots of chambers and associations out there that do it better. And so definitely look up your peer groups and benchmark them and steal all their ideas. And then again, my disclaimer is I don't always do it well, but I know where to get the answers. So if I can be helpful there, let me know. And then also talk to your attorney and talk to your accountant to make sure everything I said today matches up with them. Listen to them first.
Excellent. Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining, and everyone that's joined on today's call. Thank you so much again. The 5 ways to use your foundation. So the PowerPoint is now live and available in the webinar and resource center. And then just as a reminder for those that joined a little late, Institute is a CAE and CCE approved provider. So this webinar does qualify for 1 hour of CAE credit and 1 point of CCE credit. And you can request the certificate by emailing our inbox. I'm just going to drop that in the chat. Again, thank you all for joining us, and the recording will be available typically within about 48 hours. Thank you again, Bob. And if anybody has questions, I steer you to him. A wealth of knowledge. We're lucky to have you as previous volunteer and current faculty member. So thank you everyone for joining, and thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
Yeah.